Sniff to find out where and when they were purchased. Dresden China clock, French steel, and silver.
Fridge on. Fridge on.
There were only 3 clocks, sir. Unless you count the cookie clock.
No, I do not count the clock.
أيوة وأكيد هي
Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all. At the outset, I'd like to wish all of you a very big shkoyach, that this is how you are choosing to spend your Erev public holiday. Unless, of course, you are in Israel and it is not an Erev public holiday, and then shkoyach for being in Israel. That's also worthy of a shkoyach. And although this evening's gathering will be more intimate than our other gatherings, we certainly have a lot of quality individuals here, and I am more than happy to offer a shiur for those who wish to learn Torah tonight and any night of the year. We've reached the end of the book of Bereshit, Parashat Vayechi, the focus of this week's parasha being Yaakov's blessings for his children for the future. This evening's shiur is generously sponsored by Anna Levine and Sarah Bell in loving memory of their father, Avraham Wadman, Zichrono Livracha, who passed away 29 years ago, and his yortzeit is this evening, the 17th of Tevet. The major protagonists of this evening's shiur are Ephraim and Menashe, two characters who we met last week and two characters who we've spoken about before. I think I wrote about them in last week's Mizrahi Matters, and we've discussed them in the past. However, my hope is that even if we have discussed these characters in the past, the reflections I'm going to share with you this evening are different from the ones we've discussed in the past, and we're going to look at these characters from a new angle and their role and what they represent in terms of Jewish continuity. And our starting point is last week's parsha, where we met the two boys. Vayikra Yosef et Shem HaBechor Menashe. Yosef called his older son Menashe. Why? Ki nashani Elokim et kol amali ve'et kol beit avi, because Hashem has helped me forget all of my toils and all of my father's household. Now this is a very strange name. Why would Yosef want to forget his father's household? This can be explained in different ways. I did so in Shul on a Friday night a few weeks ago. But also, if you want to forget something, the very worst name to call your son is forget. It's a constant reminder of that which you want to forget. So clearly Yosef did not want to forget his troubles and his father's household. On a simple level, we could explain that he was grateful for having the emotional availability to put these thoughts to the side and the ability to move on with his life. Nevertheless, his first son is called Menashe. Ve'et Shem Hasheni kara Ephraim, and the second one he called Ephraim, Ki hifrani Elokim be'eretz onyi, because Hashem has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So these are the two boys who we met last week. And this week we have a key passage where Yosef brings his two sons to his father Yaakov in order for him to bless them. And as we know, Yosef intentionally brought the two lads before his father, placed them. He placed the older son Menashe where he would be under Yaakov's right hand, and the younger son Ephraim, which was going to be Yaakov's left hand. However, we read in source number 2, Vayishlach Yisrael et yemino vayashet al rosh Ephraim v'hu hatzair. Yisrael, Yaakov, stretched out his right hand and he placed it on the head of Ephraim, the younger son. Ve'etzmolo al rosh Menashe, and his left hand on the head of Menashe, the older son. Sikelet yadav, he crossed his hands over. Ki Menashe haBechor, even though Menashe was the firstborn. And so Yaakov crosses over his hands in order to bless the boys. And now we have the content of the blessing itself. Vayivarech et Yosef, and he blessed Yosef. Vayomer, and he says, Ha'elokim asher talchu avotai lefanav, God who my fathers walked before, Avraham v'Yitzchak. Ha'elokim, God, haro'eh oti me'odi ad hayom hazeh, Hashem, who has shepherded me from my very beginning until this day. Hamalach hago'el oti mikol ra, may the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, Yivarech et hana'arim, may he bless these lads. V'karev v'hem shemi, and may my name be called upon them. V'shem avotai Avraham v'Yitzchak, and the names of my fathers Avraham v'Yitzchak. V'yidgu la'rov b'kerev ha'aretz, and may they multiply like fish in the midst of the land. And soon, in what I'd like to do this evening is to focus on these boys, Ephraim and Menashe, two biblical characters who we know almost nothing about, and try and work out why, until this day, we bless our children to be like Ephraim and like Menashe. There are classical answers which we're not going to go into this evening. We're going to go into more novel explanations this evening. But before we even go there, I just want to comment on the difference between the psukim we've just read and how we ended off last week's shiur. To remind ourselves, in source number 3, at the end of last week's shiur, we looked at the discussion between Paro and Yaakov when these two great leaders, Yaakov, the leader of monotheism, meets Paro in Mitzrayim. And there they had the strangest conversation. Vayomer Paro el Yaakov kama yemei shnei chayecha. Paro asked Yaakov, how old are you? And last week we explained, based on Ramban, that Paro had never seen anyone in his life who looked as old as Yaakov. And that is because Yaakov wore his suffering so much. Vayomer Yaakov el Paro, and Yaakov said to Paro, yemei shnei mugurai shloshim u'miat shana, you know I'm only 130 years old. However, do you want to know why I look so old? Me'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shnei chayai. The days of the years of my life have been few and difficult. V'lo hisigu et yemei shnei chayei avotay b'mei migoreihem. And I'm not even as old as my father and my grandfather got to in this world. Yaakov in last week's parsha is a bitter person who has aged incredibly because of how they've worn their suffering in their life. And we saw last week, now in source number 4, Ma'at v'ra'im, that the Midrash is critical of Yaakov. Sheyesh b'midrash hikpid HaKadosh Baruch Hu al ma she'amar Ma'at v'ra'im. Hashem was angry with him and there was a bad consequence. V'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem said to Yaakov, Ani melataticha meLavan. Why are you complaining? I saved you from Lavan. Ani etzalticha me'esav. I rescued you from Esav. Ani etzalticha mishchem. I saved you from Shchem. Ani echzarticha Dinah. I returned Dinah to you. Ani echzarticha Yosef. I returned Yosef to you. Time after time, I've rescued you and saved you and returned your children to you. V'ata amarta me'at v'ra'im. And you say that your life has been short and difficult. Chayecha by your life, I'll call teva v'teva she'amarta egarei shnachat mishnotecha. I'm going to take 1 year off your life for each word that you said. And so in last week's shiur, we saw an embittered, negative, pessimistic Yaakov who is punished because of his bitterness. But what did we just read? In this week's parasha, how does Yaakov talk? The grandchildren are brought before him, and Yaakov talks about Hashem, Haro'eh oti me'odi ad hayom hazeh, Hashem who shepherded me throughout my entire life. And he talks about the Malach, the angel, Hago'el oti mikol ra, who has redeemed me from every evil. Yaakov in this week's parasha is a positive person who acknowledges the redemption and protection and shepherding he's received throughout his life. And what's the difference between last week's parasha and this week's parasha? The difference is 17 years. And time heals. And what has happened between last week's parasha and this week's parasha is that Yaakov has had the opportunity to come to terms with his suffering, to develop a different perspective. The difficult and bitter and negative Yaakov from last week, 17 years later, before he passes away, is a very different Yaakov. And so this week we have Yaakov who acknowledges that he's been redeemed mikol ra, from every single evil. He has a different approach to the world, which is a positive message for us to acknowledge that time does heal. And with the passage of time, even the harshest of circumstances and situations, Be'ezrat Hashem, we should be able to move on. Let's return to our key focus for this evening. These two boys, Ephraim and Menashe. To this day, we bless our sons to be like Ephraim and Menashe, though we bless our daughters to be like our matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. And so we need to ask ourselves, what was so special about Ephraim and Menashe that we bless our children to be like them, that we want our children to emulate them? And when we bless our children to be like Ephraim and Menashe, what exactly do we have in mind? I have before my eyes on my screen Menashe, my father-in-law, who would have heard this question in my wedding speech, because my father shares the name of Yaakov's younger son, Yosef's younger son Ephraim, and my father-in-law's Hebrew name is Menashe. And so in my wedding speech, I spoke about Ephraim and Menashe, but what we're going to be discussing this evening, Charles, is a little bit different to what I said then. Then I gave 3 classical answers, that they were the first Jewish brothers to get along. that they were the first Jewish boys to be born and raised in Chutz La'aretz. The third answer was somewhat similar to what we're going to see now in the Netziv in source number 5. And the Netziv explains that Ephraim and Menashe represent two different approaches to the world. And he says, Shelo haya Ephraim kodem leMenashe, ela binyanim ruchaniyim. Let's remember that Yaakov pushed his hand over and he prioritized the younger son over the older son, which was a recipe for disaster in the context of the book of Breshit, showing favoritism to one child over another. Nevertheless, the Netziv says that Ephraim's superiority was in the spiritual world. Everything above the natural way of the world. When it comes to the matters of this world, Menashe took precedence, and Menashe was greater than Ephraim. So the Netziv is saying that we have these two boys who both took after their father Yosef. Ephraim was Yosef's spiritual successor. He was the one who took on the world of spirituality and Torah. Menashe was the one who knew what was going on in the corridors of powers. He was the macher. He knew how to make things happen. Menashe also took after his father Yosef, but these two boys were very different. Similarly, in source number 6, the Netziv again. Ephraim u'Menashe haya kol echad gdulato meshane mechavero. Ephraim and Menashe each had different strengths. Ephraim haya gadol b'Torah. Ephraim was the one who was great in Torah, v'davak lelokav, and he cleaved to his God. U'Menashe b'halichot olam. Again, Menashe was the one who was greater in worldly matters, v'osek b'tzarchei Yisrael, engaged in the needs of Israel, engaged in the needs of the community. Ephraim was more in the ivory tower, in the study of Torah and the concepts of Torah. Menashe was the one who was getting involved in communal leadership. And so in source number 7, at the top of page 2, the Netziv explains why we bless our children to be both like Ephraim and Menashe. And the Netziv's starting point is a different starting point from ours. Because he says, Shebesha'at milah mevarchin kacha. When do we bless our children to be like Ephraim and Menashe? So some of you will tell me that it's on Erev Yom Kippur. And some of you will tell me that you do it every single Friday night. The Netziv of Volozhin says that this is the bracha which you give at a Brit Milah. He wasn't familiar with the concept of blessing children when they are older to be like Ephraim and Menashe. So it's only a very fresh young baby when he's 8 days old, when we bless him to be like Ephraim and Menashe. And in that context, the Netziv explains. V'ha'inyan, it's explained as follows. Sheyadua she'eino ra'oi levarech et adam ela me'ein birkotav shebricho Hashem ad כה. The Netziv says, it is only appropriate to bless somebody based on the context of the blessings that Hashem has already given to him up to this point. For example, la'asher ba'oshra or la'chacha b'chochmato. If somebody is wealthy, then you bless them with wealth. If somebody is wise, then you bless them concerning their wisdom. V'im kain, and so said the Netziv, ein ra'oi levarech lemi she'eino osek b'Torah sheyeh ke'Ephraim. It's inappropriate to bless somebody who is not going to be a great Torah scholar to be like Ephraim. V'chein lemi she'eino osek b'haviyot ha'olam sheyeh ke'Menashe. And somebody who's not going to be involved in worldly matters, don't bless them to be like a Menashe. So the Netziv says, when you bless somebody, don't give them a generic blessing. Give them a personalized blessing. Find out what their strengths are, what they have to give to the world, and bless them that what they have to give will be done in the best and most meaningful possible way. However, when a child is 8 days old, how do you know what that child's strengths are? And so the Netziv says, Aval b'sha'at milah, at the time of a Brit Milah, it's still unknown the path that this child will go on. As yivarech, so you bless Yisrael, Yisimcha Elokim ke'Ephraim. The bracha is, may you be like Ephraim, im yeh osek batorah yatzliach kamohu, so that if you will be a Torah scholar, be successful like Ephraim. V'chim Menashe, and we also say you should be successful like Menashe. Im yasuk b'havayot olam yeh keMenashe. If this person is going to be involved in worldly matters, be successful like Menashe. And so the Netziv of Volozhin understands the bracha of Yisimcha Elokim ke Ephraim v'chim Menashe to mean, may Hashem bless you to be either like Ephraim or like Menashe. And you give this blessing to a very young child because you don't yet know the way in which that child is going to grow up. I find this comment of the Netziv to be a difficult explanation. I'm not comfortable with it. It's very much in the style of the Netziv, because I view this as being an elitist explanation. When the Netziv says, don't bless somebody who can't be an Ephraim to be an Ephraim, the Netziv, Volozhin, Lithuanian yeshiva world starting point is that it's not for everybody to be Torah scholars. It's for the elite few who can study in Volozhin. Torah belongs to them, but not everybody's going to be an Ephraim. That's the Netziv's starting point, and I'm uncomfortable with that starting point because I more naturally identify with the democratization of education and the belief that anybody and everybody should have their chelek in Torah and should have their portion in Torah. Some may understand this explanation of the Netziv as being coming not from a place of elitism, as I understand it, but from a place of tolerance. You know, if the rabbi comes along to his community and says, you know what, I understand such high standards are difficult to expect of everybody. Let's put the standard a little bit lower. People might come along and say, this rabbi understands us. This rabbi is tolerant. This rabbi gets us. We like this rabbi. From my perspective, if you lower the standards from where people can achieve, I view that as a sign of disrespect. Why aren't you expecting more of people? Why aren't you expecting them to really achieve the way they can achieve? So to a certain extent, this approach of the Netziv is a more tolerant approach because he's not expecting everybody to be a Torah scholar. At the same time, it's somewhat of an elitist approach and a disrespectful approach to those who he doesn't believe can have their chelek in Torah. And so this isn't the explanation I gave in my wedding speech. I gave a different explanation, which was similar, but it was that the bracha of being like Ephraim and Menashe is not to be either like Ephraim or like Menashe, but to be both like Ephraim and Menashe. That we want each of our children to excel in both of these worlds, to be engaged in Torah, immersed in Torah, and engaged with the world, to excel in the world of Ephraim, and to also be involved in worldly matters as well. That it's not a choice between the two, but we can each have our chelek in Torah, but also be connected to the world. Now, at the beginning of this week, I was a guest speaker at the Yarchei Kala for the Koilel Menachem Lubavitch in Chabad. And the same thing always happens whenever I'm a guest speaker in Chabad. I come along and I speak from my perspective and my world and my sources. And at the end, an esteemed member of Chabad will come up to me and say, do you know what the Rebbe says on what you just said? And I receive a lesson in what the Rebbe says about what I just spoke about. So this week I thought I'd be one step ahead. And even before going to them, I thought instead of you telling me what the Rebbe says, I'm going to tell you what the Rebbe says. So I found the original source later in the week with the help of Rabbi Johnson, the Rosh Kollel. But I found what the Rebbe says about this concept of Ephraim and Menashe, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And I also think is very, very relevant for Melbourne Jewry in particular. So I had to say this was brilliant when I was the guest speaker on Sunday. Now I don't have to, and it really is a brilliant explanation of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he takes us back to the meaning of these two names and what's going on here. And the Rebbe says in source number 8, Chayvan she'Ephraim chashuv yoter miMenashe. The Rebbe asks, if Ephraim is the one who's supposed to go under the right hand, and so if Ephraim is supposed to be the superior son, why did Hashem decide that Menashe would be born first? Clearly, from Hashem's perspective, there's an advantage to Menashe because Menashe is the Bechor. יוצא מכך שיש גם למנשה מעלה על פני אפרים. Menashe must have an advantage over Ephraim. שבזכותה הוא בכור יוסף, and as a result of that advantage, Menashe is the firstborn. אך בקשר לברכת יעקב, however, in the context of the blessings of Yaakov, חשוב יותר העניין שבו נעלה Ephraim על מנשה. In that particular context, Ephraim is prioritized over Menashe. ולפיכך, and in that context, וישם את Ephraim לפני מנשה, Ephraim is placed before Menashe. What the Lubavitcher Rebbe is describing is a model whereby Ephraim does have an advantage over Menashe, but Ephraim is not the Bechor. And so Menashe also has an advantage over Ephraim. What are their respective advantages? He explains that this is reflected in their names. Hayavdal bein Menashe and Ephraim, the difference between Menashe and Ephraim. By the way, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's original Sikha in 1970 was in Yiddish. This is just a Hebrew translation. V'chein ha'uvda she'legabe Yosef, Menashe chashuv yoter. And the reason why when Yosef places the boys before his father, he prioritizes Menashe. Ulegabe Yaakov Ephraim chashuv, and Ephraim, and Yaakov says, no, Ephraim's the most important one. This is a debate between the father and son. Who's more important? Yuvnu min hamashma'ot hapnimit hamistateret b'shoni shebein shmotehem. It can all be understood in the hidden meaning of the difference of their names. Shnei hashemot, these two names, mevatim et haragashot she'orara etzel Yosef yiridato leMitzrayim, that going down to Egypt made Yosef feel. So when Yosef is down there in Egypt, away from his home, physically and emotionally distanced from his father's household, he had two opposite emotions. He had two completely opposite approaches to being in that position. Hashem Menashe, the name Menashe, Maskir li Yosef shenashani Elokim et kol amali v'et kol beit avi. Menashe is all about the fact that Hashem has made him forget his troubles and his father's household, which means shehu nimtza b'makom shemashkichehu et beit avi. The name Menashe is all about the fact that he's been placed in a context which naturally makes him forget his father's household. He's in a foreign culture which would go against those values. And at the same time, and therefore the name Menashe expresses Yosef's desires not to forget. It's all about the connection to his father's household. The name Menashe is all about not forgetting. You call your son forget if you want to remember. It's about the fact that you're in a society and an environment which will make you forget those values, but nevertheless you want to remember where you've come from. L'umat zot, on the other hand, Ephraim, the name Ephraim, Hifrani Elokim be'eretz onyi, that Hashem has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Mahaveh shevach v'hodaya la'yitaron ve'italut. That is just an expression of praise and thanksgiving for the value and the advantage, Hefrani, this fruitfulness, shenigramu li Yosef b'Mitzrayim, that were caused to Yosef in Mitzrayim. So on the one hand, Yosef senses Menashe. He feels a need to be defensive, to fight against the culture in which he finds himself, to remember his father's household and those values. He's focused on the past, and at the very same time, he is Ephraim. He acknowledges how he's been creative and transformative and fruitful in this galut in which he finds himself. Shnei ha'inyanim ha'mevuta'im b'shemot Menashe ve'Ephraim. These two concepts, kshurim b'shtei drachim shonot hakayamot ba'avodat b'nei Israel be'eretz onyi begalut, are connected to the two ways that we as the Jewish people have survived in exile. Two completely opposite models of how to approach the darkness of exile. Derech achat, one approach is, hizarut me'ashpa'at hasviva lidei shmira al kesher beit avi. It is being cautious from the influence of your surroundings by fighting to maintain that connection with your father's household. Hayudi mazkir la'atzmo tamid shehu nimtza b'matzav hamashkicheu et beit avi. Your entire identity is about reminding yourself that the environment in which you find yourself makes you forget those values of where you've come from. And as a result, you do not forget this. So that's one approach to Galut. Derech Achereti, the other way is, Hu nimtza v'poel b'toch eretz onyi. You don't just fight against the culture in which you find yourself, yearning for where you've come from, but within that culture and within that suffering and within that darkness, you are active. V'sham, and there, b'toch hagalut, in the depth of exile, hu yagea v'oved la'ir et choshech hagalut ba'or ha'kedusha, you work and you toil to lighten up the darkness of galut with the light of sanctity. Ad kadei shehifrani Elokim, ad kadei kach shehifrani Elokim be'eretz onyi, to the extent that Hashem can even make you fruitful in that land of suffering. Davka sham, davka in the darkness, in that difficult place, you've been fruitful and creative. Ultimately, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says we need both. Mikach baru, it is clear. She'etzel kol Yehudi tzrichot liot kayamot shtei ha'avodot. Every Jew needs to have these two opposite emotions, movements. Hein avodato shel Menashe, hein avodato shel Ephraim. We have to have that Menashe element of remembering where we've come from, and the Ephraim element of being fruitful and creative and transformative in the circumstances where we find ourselves now. And so, just to take this one little step further, the bracha of Ephraim and Menashe is to bless our children like the name Ephraim, to hearken back to our values and where we've come from. Sorry, like the name Menashe, to look at our history, and like the name Ephraim, to be forward-looking and creative at the same time as well. And we have them both. And Yosef brings these two boys before his father, Yaakov, and Yosef prioritizes Menashe because Yosef's Jewish identity was dominated by the world of Menashe, by where he came from, by maintaining that connection to his father's household. And his father, Yaakov, looks at him and he says, no, you've got to swap them around. That cannot be the recipe for success in the future. We need them both. But Ephraim must now take the place of Menashe. Our focus needs to be a positive and forward-looking focus, not just fighting the culture in which you find yourself and trying to maintain where you've come from. I think this is a hugely relevant Perush for Melbourne Jewry today. Because Melbourne Jewry, to a large extent, if you think about the major institutions in Melbourne Jewry today, were built by the heroes who resettled here in Australia after the Shoah. And so much of Jewish identity in Melbourne is the identity of Menashe. Why be Jewish? Because we have to rebuild that which was destroyed in the Shoah. And this expresses itself in so many elements of our community. And why people are so careful about certain minhagim. And chas v'shalom, should you change this or that? Because the motivation is that it has to be the way it was in my father's household or in my grandfather's household. And you can't change the recipes and you can't change many things because the motivation is to sustain and rebuild and maintain a connection to our past and where we've come from. And that is hugely praiseworthy. And the reason why we have such a strong community today is because of those Menashe individuals. However, there's a big challenge with the world of Menashe. And the challenge is that in the short term, it can motivate those with those memories to behave in that way. But in the long term, it's a recipe for disaster. Because whilst one generation is motivated by the Shoah to be Jewish and to come to Shul and to be engaged in the community, for the next generation, and every generation you move away from the Shoah, the less of a magnet the Shoah is going to be for being a reason for being Jewish and being engaged in the community. And we're seeing that happening today in the second and third generations after the Shoah, which means we need to have a complete change in the way we approach Jewish identity here in Melbourne, where our focus has to be on, not only on Shoah memory, which is hugely important, chas v'shalom, not to forget, but at the same time, we have to provide a positive reason to be Jewish, a positive, forward-looking, creative reason to be engaged in the Jewish community, reasons that have nothing to do with where we're coming from, and everything to do with what we can achieve today and where we are going to. And so when Yosef brings his two sons to his father Yaakov and he's prioritizing Menashe, Yaakov says, that's all well and good, but when we want to ensure the future, I'm going to prioritize Ephraim because the positive identity needs to be the dominant one, whilst the Menashe element is still a very important element, and we need them both. There's a very short exchange earlier on in the book of Breshit where this idea is expressed. It's a conversation between Hagar and an angel. Hagar is on the run. And the angel of Hashem finds her by the spring of water, Bamidbar, in the wilderness, ala ayin b'derech Shur, there by the spring in the way of Shur. Vayomer, and now the angel asks Hagar two questions. He says, Hagar Shifchat Sarai, question number one, Aim izevat, where are you coming from? Question number two, Va'ana telechi, and where are you going to? Va'tomer, and she responds, and she only answers question number one, B'pnei Sarai gverati anochi barachat. I'm running away from Sarai, my mistress, because she had such a difficult time there, because of the context of what developed in that family. The angel asks her, where are you coming from and where are you going to? She only knew the answer of where she was coming from. She had no idea where she was going to because she didn't have a destination in mind. The entire focus of her journey was running away. Now, there's nothing wrong with leaving something which is bad, but if you're escaping something and you don't have a destination in mind, you're in very big danger that you're going to end up not where you started, but somewhere much worse. So the angel of Hashem said to her, Shuvi el gvirtech, go back home to your mistress, and suffer under her hand. He's not being cruel. He's not telling her, go home and suffer. He's telling her, if you don't know where you're going, then maybe this isn't a very wise journey for you to take. Because a journey has to have a point of where we're coming from, a point of departure, but a successful journey needs to have a destination as well. And if we as a nation are only focused on where we've coming from and we have no idea where we are going to, that as a journey is a dangerous journey. It is, of course, essential to remember where we've come from. Zechira is hugely important. It is part of our personality. Chas v'shalom, should any of us ever forget our family histories or our personal histories, whether that's in Europe or North Africa or the Middle East or wherever that history happens to come from. But with that memory, we have to understand that the concept of memory in the Torah is always connected to action. Example number one in source number 10. Vayizkor Elokim et Noach, and Hashem remembered Noach, Vet kol hachaya, vet kol habehema, asher ito bateva, and all the wild animals and the domesticated animals who are with him in the teva. There is memory, and as a result of the memory, in the very same pasuk, Vayaver Elokim ruach ala haaretz vayishoku hamayim. Hashem made a wind blow over the land, and the waters withdrew. Hashem stopped the flood. Vayizkor Elokim, Hashem remembers, followed by action. Similarly, in source number 11, Vayhi b'shachet Elokim et arei hakikar, and it was when Hashem destroyed the cities of the plain. Then we have memory. Vayizkor Elokim et Avraham, Hashem remembered Avraham, and as a result of that memory, Vayishalach et Lot mitoch ha'afecha, then he sent Lot from that upheaval, ba'afach et harim asher yashav behin Lot, when he overturned the cities where Lot lived. Vayizkor Elokim, whenever we're told that Hashem remembers, it's immediately followed by action. Source number 12, Vayizkor Elokim et Rachel, and Hashem remembered Rachel. What does he do with that memory? Vayishma eleh, he listened to her, and Elokim, Hashem listened to her, and as a result, Vayiftach et Rachma, he opened up her womb and he gave her a child. Action. And the final example I'll give you, it's a bit further in the Torah, at the beginning of the book of Shmot, in next week's parasha. Vayishma Elokim et nakatam, Hashem heard their outcry. Vayizkor Elokim et brito, Hashem remembered his covenant. Et Avraham et Yitzchak ve'et Yaakov, with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And what happens as the result of Hashem remembering? Vayar Elokim et bnei Israel, Hashem saw the Israelites, Vayida Elokim, and he made himself known. We have Yetziat Mitzrayim, we have action. In the Torah, Zechira, memory, is always connected to action. Memory is hugely important, but memory which is just a memory is a problem. Because then what's the value? It'll help the individual with the memory, but it's not going to help anyone else. Memory must provoke and prompt action in order for it to play a positive and valuable role for us. Menashe is of tremendous value, but Menashe needs the Ephraim, needs that activity in order for it to achieve meaning. And the opposite is true as well. Ephraim is hugely important. It's important to be productive and fruitful and creative in this world. But when we're moving forwards, that has to be informed by the Menashe. It has to be based on where we are coming from to guide us where to go forwards. And so this interplay between Ephraim and Menashe, where to a certain extent Ephraim has the upper hand, but in another way Menashe has the upper hand, it's reflected in one single phrase in this week's Parsha, which is a beautiful phrase when you acknowledge the complexity in this phrase. Because in source number 14 we are told, Vayevarchem bayom hahu lemor. And Yaakov blessed them on that day, saying as follows, B'cha yivarech Yisrael lemor, by you Israel should bless, saying, Yisimcha Elokim ki Ephraim v'chem Menashe, may Hashem place you to be like Ephraim and like Menashe. Vayasem et Ephraim lifnei Menashe, and he placed Ephraim before Menashe. What is the meaning of these final 5 words of this passage? We know that he's crossed over his hands. And Yosef says, no, my father, do it the other way around. And Yaakov says, Yosef, I know what I'm doing. And he crossed over his hands. We know that's happened. And then he gives the blessing and he says, you should be like Ephraim and Menashe in that order. It's black on white in front of our eyes. What does the Torah then mean when it says, Vayasem et Ephraim lifnei Menashe, and he put Ephraim before Menashe? We know that. It's just drilling the point home. We've seen it time and time again in this passage. And so Rabbeinu Bachya in source number 15 shows that this phrase can mean one of 2 things, which are actually complete opposites. The classic explanation, which is the way I've understood this until this past Sunday, when I learned Rabbeinu Bachya on the Parsha. Vayasem et Ephraim lifnei Menashe. Generally, we understand this to mean Yaakov put Ephraim before Menashe. That he put him before Menashe in all of the blessings. In everything that he did, he prioritized Ephraim. Though Ephraim was the younger one, that's what he did. Because he saw the value of Ephraim being greater than the firstborn. That is the general classic explanation. What does it mean he put Ephraim before Menashe? Because Ephraim beats Menashe. At which point, if I would have said this in my wedding speech, it would have been a little bit awkward talking about Ephraim having priority over Menashe. But the second explanation of Rabbeinu Bachya completely changes everything around, which is complex and beautiful. And he says as follows, actually you can explain this the completely opposite way around. Lifnei Menashe, what does it mean that he placed Ephraim before Menashe? Lefanav mamash, he literally made him stand in front of Menashe. This isn't a conceptual description of who comes first. He actually took Ephraim and he placed him in front of Menashe. It's not that he was saying that Ephraim takes priority here. He was doing this to show how the older brother is the greater one. Yaakov wants to teach Ephraim Musar, ethics, and the way to behave. He's trying to teach Ephraim to respect his older brother Menashe. Like when you physically place one person in front of another person as an expression of the fact that the other person is the greater one and the one who's in front of them is lower in the hierarchy. So Yaakov crosses over his hands, which is a recipe for disaster in the book of Breshit. And you can scream out and you can ask, what are you doing, Yaakov? Haven't you learned the lessons of favoritism? Have you not suffered enough with Yosef that now at the end of your life you're making the same mistake again? Family after family, we've had problems in the book of Breshit, and the very first family on earth, with the first siblings on earth, Cain kills Hevel. And then with Avram's children, you have Yitzchak and Ishmael. And with Yitzchak's children, you have Yaakov and Esav. And with Yaakov's children, you have Yosef and his brothers. And it comes on to these two lovely boys, Ephraim and Manasseh. What on earth is Yaakov thinking? Showing favoritism to one son over another son, and he shows favoritism to the younger son. But what we see here is that Yaakov knew exactly what he was doing. And while it was necessary, in the context of that bracha, to place his right hand on Ephraim's head, he takes Ephraim immediately and he puts him in front of Manasseh. And he says, now you'd better respect and look up to your older brother. Because in the future, Ephraim will, though he's the younger brother, have a certain advantage over the older brother. The grandfather places him in front of Manasseh to warn him to show respect to Manasseh, not to lord it over his older brother and not to show off to his older brother. Yaakov has learned the lessons of the past. And so Yaakov, whilst doing what was necessary in the context of that bracha, Vayasem et Ephraim lifnei Manasseh, he takes this younger brother and he says, look up to your older brother. He will always be your older brother. He is the Bechor, and you have to respect him because he is the Bechor. Now, earlier this evening, I received a WhatsApp message from Reb Lior Bro. Reb Lior is a wonderful man for those of you who don't know him. And Reb Lior had clearly looked through the Makorot for tonight's shiur, though he can't attend, just to know what I was going to say and what's on my Daf Makorot. And Reb Lior sent me an image of what the Khatam Sofer says about Rabbeinu Bachya. So those of you who've printed out the source sheets already, this is a late edition. And we'll conclude with what Reb Lior adds into these words. Because the Khatam Sofer says in source number 16, Ita Rabbeinu Bachya Shemafaresh. Rabbeinu Bachya explains, as we've just seen, Lifnei Manasseh lefanav mamash, when he placed Ephraim before Manasseh, he literally placed him in front of him. And then the Khatam Sofer says, Ulefiza, based on this, Efshar lomar shezehu atzmo perush habracha yisimcha elokim keEphraim v'chemnasseh. We can now understand the blessing for our boys to be like Ephraim and like Manasseh. Klomar, i.e., Gam im ta'aleh b'ma'alot al shar b'nei adam chaverecha. We bless our children to say, even if you grow up to be greater than everyone else around you, what more could a parent wish than for their children to grow up to be fantastic and the best? Afilu hachi, nevertheless, we warn our children, al titga'eh aleihem, do not be arrogant with other people around you and don't lord it over them and don't be proud. That is the blessing, to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, because it is a model of respect and love and understanding, and most importantly, humility. The model of Ephraim and Manasseh is getting along and not showing off, where in some contexts or some ways you are greater than other people, for indeed, in other ways and other contexts, they are greater than you. And so the Khatam Sofer explains, this is the bracha of being like Ephraim and Manasseh. V'zeu shene'emar, like it says in Kohelet, im ruach hamoshel ta'aleh alecha. If the spirit of authority comes upon you, mekomcha al tanach, don't follow that spirit. Don't follow those thoughts. Just stay where you are. Stay humble. Keep true to being just the good person who you are. So this evening, we've looked at a few different ways of explaining the bracha to be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Let's call them the less novel explanations of this phrase. We've seen the approach of the Netziv of Volozhin, where Ephraim was the Torah scholar and Manasseh was the politician, the macher, the man of the world, the businessman. And the Netziv says you're hedging your bets. Maybe he'll be like one, maybe he'll be like the other. But another way to view it is that we bless all of our children to be like both and to encompass both of these worlds. We saw the explanation of the Lubavitcher Rebbe that Manasseh has a focus on the past, on nostalgia, on where you're coming from, which is an important ingredient in Jewish identity. And Ephraim has a focus on being creative. It's the focus on the future, which ultimately, moving forwards, needs to be the focus. And we've seen the approach of the Khatam Sofer as well, that the bracha of Ephraim and Manasseh is the bracha of showing that humility, of getting along with each other. Avi says lefanav can mean facing, which is, yes, what happens? He took him and he pushed him in front of him, facing him in front of his face. And he's making sure that however great you are, be respectful to others, especially those who are older than us. May we all be blessed to be like Ephraim and Menashe, and may our children all be blessed to emulate them as well. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.
Koyach. Brilliant. Fantastic.
Shkoyach.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank
shukran.
you. Shkoyach.
Thank you, Howard. Howard, and refuah shleima to you. This is your
Thank you
first
very
day
much.
after surgery, so
Thank you very much.
wonderful to see you. Welcome back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Australia.
Shabbat Shalom, Australia.
Shabbat Shalom. A big Yashikach, Rabbi Mervis.
Sure.
Yeah,
Shabbat shalom,
Shkoyach.
Israel.
Happy 2021.
Okay.